Hi everybody. In this 3D render video, we're going to take a look at some intermediate to advanced lighting techniques within D5 render. I'll show a number of different scenes and I'll run through the important settings that we use. And we're going to look at things like fog, the ambient occlusion slider, line weight, and even contrast and saturation. Hopefully, by the time you're done with this video, you'll have a better understanding of some lesser used D5 rendering tools, especially under the Effects tab. And hopefully, it can help take your renders to a new and hopefully better level. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody. So here we are in one of the test scenes that we'll use. And the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to sort of intermediate to advanced lighting is the use of fog. Fog is one of those things that, you can do it relatively easily in D5 as a big setting just down here. And a lot of users don't generally use fog. Now, I think fog will add a slight dreamy, ethereal quality to your work. I'll get into that in a second. One thing I do want to mention, though, is the use of fog planes. So if we hit M on the keyboard and we go to models and we go to particles, you can see we've got a lot of these plane fog. So it's basically, think of just like a flat rectangle with kind of like rotating opacity on it. And so this is just going to sit on your scene. You can put the display to real time and you can have these move at certain speeds. But if you're just doing still renders, honestly, it's okay to just leave them off. They don't need to actually be, in real time doing anything. So you can just take the velocity down completely, just down to 1. But all in all, these planes are really efficient and they're really lightweight when it comes to adding fog. And they'll add a really nice sort of dreamy effect to your actual work. Now, fog itself, the more traditional style of fog, is going to basically be found under the Environment tab and Fog. Now, fog can be kind of difficult to work with in D5. There's a slight delay. So if we turn on fog, how I would recommend you approach this is I'm going to turn off the scattering. First thing to do is just crank the intensity of the fog and then change it to super bright red. After that, this will allow you to see it. But after that, just crank pretty much all of these sliders. Now, if I go back here, just kind of my camera is like right here, whatever, just somewhere around here. We can start adjusting the start distance, which is basically how far off that fog is actually going to be. And I'm just going to move this down to, I want it to be sort of just on the edge of the building. Then we'll adjust the fall off and the actual height sliders, basically trying to find a nice ground somewhere in the middle with these sliders, and just to get the look we're going for. Once we have that, that's when we can change the color back to white. And that is going to be when we can drop the intensity or strength of the fog. Now, scattering is going to be really important later on because scattering is going to allow us to fake basically sun rays or God rays. In other words, if you have a bright light right behind the fog, it's going to cast these really nice sun ray effect. Volume light will also give your renders a bit of a dreamy quality. Now, you do want to be careful with this. You can see I have fog over here on the right, and it's definitely a case that, less is more, or at least do maybe a test render just to be sure to see how it's actually looking. So the next thing that we want to talk about is shadows within D5. And the first lighting environment that we're going to look at is basically full HDRI light in the sky. Move myself out of the way here. So you can see we are using just the Kloppenheim 06 8K, really nice one. In order to get the best from the HDRI lighting environments within D5, you will want to hit these two little buttons over here, just to the right of where it says light. This will allow you to adjust the background, basically think of the background as just a plane, right? It's just a plane that doesn't do anything. It's almost like a picture of the sky. This will just determine how bright that picture is. So depending on the scene you're going for, you might want the background to be very low brightness, but the actual skylight, the light coming out of it, to be quite high. But here we're going for a more blown out, overexposed effect. So I'm using again my Kloppenheim, and I've cranked the skylight and the background all the way up. Now please keep in mind, D5, unlike the path tracer in Twinmotion, if you turn off the sun in D5, it doesn't do the best job with shadows. None of the HDRIs, or very few of them, seem to cast very strong shadows, which is something I don't love. It's something about the way it handles light and bounces. When it comes to lighting your scene with the full skylight like this, a HDRI cranked to 100, or 1, the strongest amount, you are going to want to turn on the sun. And the sun, the interesting thing about this with D5 is you don't need the sun to be very strong to get shadows. So you can put this down pretty low. You can see no sun, 0.3, just getting some nice shadows in there. And then you can adjust the sun disk radius to determine basically the smoothness of those shadows. You generally want to avoid completely harsh shadows, and you also want to avoid completely soft shadows. Some users will just put this at like 5, like the mid-tone value, but honestly, it just kind of depends on the image you're with. Now, if you want to go a little bit further, we can also adjust the sky color, so we can tint our sky. You can see it up there in the top left. It's gone a bit more blue. And we can also tint the sun, so you could get a nice balance of cool and warmth. But honestly, for this image, I'm just going to leave things at sort of where they are. 6,500, 6,500. Now, importantly with that sun as well, the way D5 handles those, basically HDRI, which will sit on a dome, effectively, a skylight, a lot of them seem very low to the horizon, and I don't really know, why that is. I know the makers of D5 stated that it's actually harder than you think to be able to move this up and around and, move it however you want. You're going to have to go in here, and instead of having the set to follow HDRI, in other words, it'll read the hotspot of the HDRI and project the light from that. Here you will probably have to go in and manually use custom to get the results you want. So I'm going to let's put the skylight down really low just so you can see this. And I'm going to make the sun really strong. There we go. So this can be a little bit confusing. You're presented with basically altitude and azimuth. So my suggestion is when you get your HDRI sky in a position that you like, go in here and think of azimuth as A to Z, kind of like that silly Amazon logo. But azimuth is A to Z. So basically A to Z, and it's horizontal. So azimuth is just left and right. So the first thing you'll want to do is spin the sun on the azimuth, left to right. Now, you also want to make sure that your sun is vaguely in the same area as the brightest point on HDRI. You can't really have, the sun being visible in the shot and then shadows, going a different direction. People might not know exactly why the image is wrong, but they will know that something is wrong. So you keep that in mind. After you fix your azimuth, altitude is basically just exactly what it sounds like. Think of it as basically going from the ground up. So azimuth is left to right, altitude is up and down. And so you just need to find some nice compromise here where the sun is coming from a logical direction. So this is how we set up the start of our full HDRI lighting environment, just using the skylight and the sun. A couple of other things that I do want to mention that will pop up in all of the other scenes that we sort of look at is going to be the effects. And here's where we have to be kind of very mindful. There's almost no magical setting for this. And I'm going to run through the things that I think are really important and talk about some that are lesser used. Firstly, exposure. You have got to set the exposure manually within D5. And I would suggest you go in here and you do that first before doing really anything else. Sure, set up your environment, but just know that it won't look right until the exposure is done. So you may want to do the exposure absolutely first. Now, when it comes to this type of full light environment, you're going to have to take a look at the highlight local exposures. So the highlights are going to be the brightest, whitest parts of the image usually, and then the shadows are going to be literally the shadowed parts of the image. There is no magic setting for this. You want to do this on a per image basis. Now, I do want to mention, I'll come back to contrast, because contrast is super important. Okay, highlights, shadows, and slope. So my understanding of this is akin to curves, adjustment layers within Photoshop. So slope is midtones. So if you want to go in there, you can kind of adjust the mid values on your image. One thing I found, or kind of noticed a lot lately. If you're going to make changes to the shadows, you do want to also kind of work, like if you're going to darken the shadows, you might have to lighten the slope to offset it a little bit. So you can see here, if we just put all these back to their default, that's how the image is starting to look. But you will want to go in here and basically just kind of, you're going to have to make some changes here. So we've taken the slope down, which is sort of flattening the image a little bit. Then we've darkened the shadows, and we've just fooled around with the highlight button a little bit. We're trying to get that bloom right on the right-hand side of the image. Now, contrast. This is super important. If you reset this back, you can just see how kind of color-wise it's a little flat. There's nothing popping out. And so contrast, you're going to be adding contrast, I think, in most of these renders, especially these exterior renders. Again, there's no magic number for this. You're just kind of move that slider till it gets to a nice spot. White balance is going to affect the overall look and feel of your lighting. I'm not really doing a huge amount with this. I'm happy to leave the lighting with its default settings, the white balance, so whether the image is blue or sort of yellowy orange. Bloom will pop up again and again. Only caveat with bloom is make sure it's not so high that it's like, like that. That just looks terrible, so just don't do that. If it doesn't look good within, somewhere between 0.2 and a little bit higher, just be careful. Now, the next thing I want to mention is vignetting. Vignetting will do a really gorgeous sort of like darkening around the edges. I strongly recommend you do this. If you don't do this, you can kind of see the image it just doesn't suck you into the shot as much. You can, if you're doing still images, do a little vignette in D5 and then you'll add more in Photoshop. Now, there are 3 more things I want to mention in the effects tab here. Saturation. If I reset this, you can see the saturation within D5, it's very saturated by default, okay? And the same with kind of Twinmotion. All CG artwork is very saturated because all the colors tend to be like perfect. And so what you'll actually want to do with saturation is in a shot like this, if you're going for a more realistic result, using the full skylight, I would strongly suggest that you take the saturation down. Now, saturation and contrast can kind of work hand in hand to get the overall look that you're going for. And some of the other examples we'll look at use very different settings for these. But just keep in mind, saturation, definitely, you probably want to pull the saturation down in almost all these renders. Going back to what we said about, D5 struggles to just do shadows with the HDRI. So let's change this. I'm going to show you a super bright HDRI autumn field, and I will turn off the sun for this. All right. So here we're actually getting some nice shadows. They're kind of a bit too soft though. So what we can do to make our shadows in the raw render look better is to go down to the AO layer right down here. So this little fella right here, we want to turn this on. The radius is going to determine basically just how strong that ambient occlusion effect is. I found, 300 is about okay. And we'll really see it if we look at in here. So no AO, very strong. So somewhere around 300 will work fine. Now the other thing is you will want to make sure that AO overlay in preview is turned on. Okay, so when AO is turned on like this, it will render with the ambient occlusion turned on. If you have render passes set up, you can also render the AO layer out as its own separate render layer, and you can do some stuff in Photoshop. But I see no reason to not turn it on in the actual viewport. You just want to make sure it's not so strong. So the next style that we want to look at is very heavy overcast. Now, this is a pretty common look at the moment. It's very popular. It's a really beautiful look, too. And it works generally where you've got a lot of contrast going on. So in this lighting environment, we're using the Lenong HDRI. Nothing new there. It's a very old one that a lot of people use. And again, we've actually dropped if you look at the settings here, the actual skylight is actually very weak in this one. We haven't cranked up the light too much. So we've actually taken it down pretty low. So 0.3, it's very bright background-wise, so we've taken that up to the max. The only real difference here is going to be the sun. We've massively increased the sun intensity, And again, it's coming in from a custom angle. But then if we go to effect here really quickly, so what's going to be important again is going to be that exposure value, just making sure your image is not overexposed. You can also see we've done slightly different here. In this situation, we've taken the slope, the mid values, all the way up to the pretty much the top. We've dropped the shadow quite a bit. In other words, we're not really getting a huge amount of shadow information. It's almost like lifting up the shadows if you were using a curves adjustment layer. And the contrast is going to be quite high. We're sort of relying on the contrast to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the shadows. A couple of other things. We've moved the white balance a little bit over to the blues as well. Again, sort of emphasizing the grayness of this. Bloom 0.2. And we're using a very strong vignette, just like in the previous render. You'll notice again, we've got a pretty low level of saturation. And we're using the ambient occlusion slider here, the AO slider, to really ratchet up the shadows. The next setting we want to look at is outline mode. Now, outline mode is sort of, if we look at the screen here, I had gone ahead and just zoomed in on one of these plants. And if we turn on the background, the outline mode was kind of intended to be used as a more stylish way of working within D5, but we don't need the background on. And what we'll actually do is just use the outlines. You'll notice we have options for align thickness. Now look what it's doing to kind of the foliage, for example. You can see no line thickness, and then as we take this up, so it's almost going to be giving you this outline effect for all of the objects within the scene. And it's a really, really nice way. You can get some kind of darker shadows, but each object also kind of sort of like just looks thicker, more tangible. And so it's not a bad technique. So the first thing here is going to be finding a suitable HDRI. And you can see we're using the Banani Sunset 8K. This came from Polyhaven. And the thing I like about this is it's got a really rich sky. There's a lot of like pinks and blues in there. Looks very dreamy. Now we've cranked the skylight here, but put the background brightness quite low. So you're getting those clouds, but it's not overpowering. So keep that relatively low. You will have to use an additional sun here as well, but hopefully you guys are kind of comfortable with that now. And then we've got fog. And the key to this is going to be turning on that scattering. So volume light is going to give us a scattering effect. The higher you crank it, it can get a little bit too washed out. But important here is to position or rotate basically the brightest part on your HDRI. So you want to make sure that if you've got the volume scattering on, and I'm going to turn this up quite high, you'll see that it seems to be paired to really the brightest parts of the image. And so if you position it like right over here, you're getting this really strong gold rays. Now that's a bit much, but there is a nice balance you can get. So just make sure that you've got this volume light on and make sure you're using the scattering strength slider here. This will give you a pretty nice result. A little bit dreamy, a little bit ethereal. The fog will work very well in your favor. On the additional effects here, again, exposure, you'll have to drop that down low. And then what we've taken here is grabbed the highlights and we've cranked them up really high and then dimmed the shadows again. So the shadows are almost non-existent on this one, very, very low. But the mid values are taken up again quite high. So this is very similar to in Photoshop if you're working with Camera Raw. One of the ways, and we just did a video on this recently, you can give your work a more ethereal sort of dreamy quality, is to pull out the darkest values, strip away the really dark black values, and then also strip away the really bright white values. And that will give you a very medium tonal image. We've moved the white balance a little bit into the blue as well. This sort of setting, depending on the HDRI, it can look very orange. And so we kind of want to move this a little bit more into the blue. You can add bloom if you want, but just be careful depending on where the sun is pointed. That may hit right into your camera, so it might be looking the viewer directly face on. Strong vignette, and drop that saturation slider. For these dreamy looks, you can see with saturation at 1 just how bright this would actually be. So bring that down a little bit. Now again, we have the ambient occlusion turned on, and we have this at the highest value. So it's set to 1000, and in the preview, it's also set to 10. So this gives you a really good idea of how those shadows are looking. And then the line outline mode, this is where you're probably going to have to kind of come in here and really tweak this setting. By default, 0.2 to 0.5 is fine for most shots, but for ours, for this one, take it quite low. You just want a little bit of that outline around the image. You're looking for kind of a dreamy look. You have color grading right down here, and probably most D5 users don't ever use this. I know I only started using this recently. So in order to keep that dreamy look, what we've done is we've added a lot of blue to the shadows. So you can see if this is all just set back to its default, what we've done is just left click here on the blue, and you're looking at the shadows. So we've placed this in the blue range. Then we've gone to the midtones and the highlights, and you can take this ever so softly into the oranges. How you look at this, you can see if we just reset highlights or just reset all, I kind of prefer to just kind of have this HSV down here, and I click kind of where I want it to be, but you can happily just drag these sliders as well. And so if we just click on our settings here, shadows, put them in the blue, midtones, take them ever so softly into the orange, kind of making them a little bit warmer. And then the highlights, you can either go blue or go into the orange as well. For this one, I think I settled on blue. But what'll do a lot of the heavy lifting is the mid-range orange value. It doesn't have to be crazy strong, but you can see as you move the slider around, the mid-range is encompassing a lot of the color of this image. So just shifting that into the orange will do quite a bit. So the last thing we want to mention is, can you start with a LUT as your primary lighting setup? And you can. If you think of this as a LUT first or LUT forward approach, you can absolutely do that when it comes to lighting your scenes. So for example, we've got a new scene here, and I'm just going to put it back to real time. And say we go to, this is just a clear version, this is just autumn fields, and I want to go to scene 3 here, which is the same thing, so nothing's changed. And how you would do this is start by picking the LUT that you want, and crank the intensity all the way up. So LUTs generally get put on afterwards, but you can work with this LUT forward approach. So I'm starting with my LUT that I like, and now I'm looking at the image. And this Fuji Eterna seems to have basically kind of lifted up the dark values. So it's very similar to, what we've talked about in Photoshop before, that hazy sort of effect. It's a little bit retro. But once you're in this spot, this means now you can still come in and make kind of structural changes. Maybe I'll lift up the shadows that the LUT is affecting. And maybe I can try things like dropping the full shadow value down and bringing that contrast back in. I'm still keeping the overall look, which is primarily being driven by this LUT, which is really, really nice. And you can still tweak some of these values as well. And remember, you'll still want to turn on AO, and maybe I want to crank this a little bit and turn on the preview, and I also want to add that outline mode just a little bit. And you can see this starts to look kind of nice. The outline mode is really going to sort of emphasize. It's a bit too strong, so let's dial the outline back. But we're still getting a little bit of it. There we go. Just enough to add some definition to your shots.